One of the best things about sewing with vintage patterns is that there are actually a lot of options and still a lot of sewing patterns that exist. While thrifting or hunting for actual vintage clothes gets harder with time as less and less of these clothes exist or are available, sewing gives us the opportunity to make garments with the patterns of the time or close to the patterns of the time. And I think it's as close as it gets to traveling back in time and, getting those exact patterns from then and making something the way someone would make it at the time. If you're starting your sewing vintage journey or just getting into vintage sewing, it might be a little bit daunting about where to start, where to get patterns, or what even are good ones. There are two things I recommend before you even start looking for patterns. The first one is to look for references. Find magazines from the time, catalogs are really good. Watch movies from the time, not so much period reproduction, but actual movies from the era if available. A lot of these things are online or in libraries and you can access them. And looking at them and kind of creating a mood board picture in your head, or an actual mood board, Pinterest is very good for that, will help you figure out what area you're more drawn to and kind of create an idea of what you want to make, like what kind of clothing you want to make, from dresses to skirts, blouses, other stuff, to what kind of style, what kind of fabrics or prints you want to use or try to find. I honestly sometimes just try to copy things that I see in catalogs or magazines or even in other sewing patterns, because it's easier for me than to come up with something from scratch, and it's a little easier to have something to visualize and work towards rather than the other way around. I mean, you can do that too, but it is a little easier to have that in mind. And the other thing that I recommend is, once you have this idea in your head of what you're looking for, to zero out on that decade or decades that you're interested in, so that when you're actually searching for the patterns, it'll be easier the more specific you are. So it's very different to look for a 1950s or 1958 wiggle dress, very specific, and finding a pattern for that, than to look just for vintage dresses. Now, with all of that in mind, where do you actually find these patterns? I have a few resources that I'm going to share with you, and my favorite ones, and hopefully that'll help you get started in finding your own patterns. They're not usually expensive, so I do recommend getting into it, but I also recommend taking it easy because it's very easy to hoard them. I already have so many that I don't know what to do with, so be careful. The first place that I recommend looking at is actually your own community, your own area where you live. Be it looking at thrift stores or secondhand shops or things like that. They usually have some sort of sewing stuff and patterns in there. When you look for sewing patterns that are used, though, make sure to check that it has all of the pieces, because sometimes they don't have all pieces, and if it's missing something, that it's not a big deal, like, I don't know, a sleeve, that you could probably find another sleeve that will work. But if it's missing some pieces, do check used patterns. But local thrift stores are a really good place to start. Of course, you're not going to find a specific era, but you don't never know what you find, and they're usually very cheap. But when I say community, I also mean people in your life. You never know if your grandma, your aunt, your great aunt, your friend, somebody had someone who passed away and left behind a bunch of sewing patterns they don't know what to do with, or have them in their basement that they don't know what to do with. I've gotten a lot of patterns that way, gifted or passed on, and it's a little treasure trove, and you never know where they are. They were such a common thing, especially after the 1950s, to buy sewing patterns and to sew at home, that it's very likely that you know someone who already has something to share. Another place that's kind of obvious, and probably you've even already tried it, is Etsy. This is where knowing what you want helps when you're searching. And the another thing that is very important is that you check the sizing on what you're looking at online. They usually, people who list sewing patterns usually list the back of it, or somewhere where you can see the actual sizing. And it's important because sewing patterns of other times are not usually have the sizing of today, and even just for clothing sizes to sewing pattern sizing, it's not quite the same. So you have to make sure to look at the measurements, and also be aware that sewing patterns usually came in a very small range of sizes, meaning when you buy a pattern, it only comes in 2 or 3 sizes, or maybe even 1. But once you get in Etsy, there are a lot of shops selling patterns. In fact, even I am selling some of the patterns that I don't really use, or that I've already used and I'm not planning on using again. The drawback from Etsy, I would say, is that they don't have that much variety. I mean, it just depends on what people post. Some areas you will find way more than other areas. I'm pretty sure I've seen every single pattern that is on Etsy for the 1920s, for example. There are limitations, and sometimes you won't find something that you're looking for, especially, so certain areas are maybe not as popular, or certain things that are more specific, or the more back you go, the less you're gonna find. And there is a limitation of what you can see on Etsy. So this is why I also recommend considering reproduction patterns. And you will see some of these on Etsy as well. But reproduction patterns are basically not actual vintage, but either a person that took a pattern and adapted it for modern sizing, or someone finding inspiration on a vintage style and making their own pattern, or actual reproduction of patterns that existed and they're just made available again digitally or in other ways. But the nice thing about them is that they tend to have better sizing. They tend to have had some sort of extra tech check there. And also that you can sometimes buy them as PDF, so you can print them at home. It's a little more accessible, and you will know that it'll have all of the pieces. Whereas with actual vintage, you might miss some of the pieces, the sizing might not be quite right, which is why I always recommend making a mock-up or a toile of what you are gonna sew, especially with true vintage, because you never know how it's gonna fit, even if the measurements say that they're right. If you're a little scared about using the actual vintage, maybe starting with reproduction patterns will be a little easier, and you can tell when they are vintage or not. The actual vintage patterns usually come in a sleeve, and you will be able to tell that it was printed at the time. It usually even has, the dates somewhere. In fact, let me show you some of my vintage patterns. So here's a couple of vintage patterns that I have. This one is true vintage from, I think, the late 1950s, early 1960s. You can tell it's been through something. You can tell it's the sleeve of that sewing patterns used to come in, and still some of these companies still sell them like this. You can tell it's old. It has a size only for one size. And this is what I was saying, that it's great to look at the pictures, because they usually have really beautiful illustrations with not just the examples of what you can make with the pattern, but colors, and it can be inspiration even for something else. And on the back, you will see the sizing and the measurements, usually in inches. All of the pattern pieces that should be included, so you check if they actually has all of them. So true vintage pattern will look something like this, whereas a reproduction pattern tends to look something more like this. So this was printed by the person that sells the reproduction. It has more sizes. It has sizes 8 to 18, whereas the other one was only size 38. It is printed in newer paper, as you can tell. It was printed recently, and it's a reproduction of a pattern made by someone. So this is from Vintage Sewing Pattern Company, and I am very grateful to all the people who create reproduction patterns, or who are keeping these patterns that maybe they're creating more sizes from them, or they're conserving them and making them available for the public. So this is an option that's a little safer and easier to find, I would say. As for websites outside of Etsy to find vintage patterns, there are two that are my favorite that I really, really recommend. The first one is Backroom Finds. Her shop is great because not only does she have actual vintage patterns, but she also has vintage fabric. So you can really go there and shop for everything you need and get started on your vintage sewing journey very, very exact to the decade if you wanted to, which again, you don't have to, but it is interesting, and it's an inexpensive, pretty accessible pricing, and she collects a lot of sewing patterns, so that she has a lot of it available and very easy to search by era and by sizing and by type and everything you want. Another website who I actually found through Etsy but then realized she had her own website with a lot of stuff there too is Mrs. Depew. She has a very, very extensive collection going from the 1900s, early 1900s, a few things, and all up way up to the 1990s. So there is a lot of range there, and she has everything from undergarments from different eras to outerwear to children's patterns. There's a lot out there in Mrs. Depew, and I'm very grateful for all the work she does to conserve. She also even has sewing lessons from old magazines and things like that, the Women's Institute from the UK, things like that. So there is definitely a treasure trove or historical information and things that you can learn other than just buying sewing patterns. But she does have a great just collection that you can shop. Now, when I say vintage patterns, I've been mostly talking about, mid-century onwards, 1950s, sometimes 1940s, 1930s, maybe push it to the 20s. If you go beyond the 20s, it does get a little harder. I don't think that patterns for the public were as available before that, or that people sew as in the home as much, which is partly why. It's also the more you go back in time, the harder it is to find stuff as easily as something that is only like 60, 70 years ago. But if you're interested in more anything beyond that, before the 1900s, there is stuff available, and mostly by, again, people who are amazing and that could create reproductions of dresses and other garments that maybe are not based on an actual sewing pattern of the time, but they're based on the clothing, and they've made already all the research, so they make it easier for you. So if you're interested in that, which I am too, there is some stuff available out there. I, for example, recommend Red Threaded if you want to make anything that requires corset or undergarments for period costumes. Red Threaded actually sells corsets, but they also sell kits and patterns to make corsets and undergarments from everything from 1700s, 1800s, and very early 1900s. So it is amazing what you can find there, and I definitely recommend it. Another shop that I very much recommend for this type of costuming that goes beyond the 20th century is Black Snail Patterns. She's available on Etsy and on her own website. And again, beautiful, amazing reproduction garments, patterns. So that goes from the 1700s up to, I think, early 1900s as well. And the great thing is that they have men and women clothing, so you can make all sorts of things. Again, more period costuming, but very cool. And I've used some of her patterns, so they're very well researched and very easy to use. Going back to more vintage patterns that are a little more recent and not from centuries ago, one last place I do recommend looking at is the actual big pattern companies that still exist and that were putting out patterns back in the day, because a lot of them still on their website sell vintage patterns, not the actual pattern real vintage, but they are kind of reselling, repackaging and reselling patterns that they owned back in the day. So Butterick, Simplicity, McCall's, all of those big sewing pattern companies still exist, and it's very easy to find them on their websites. So that's another place to look for. I don't know if you would call it reproduction. I guess they are reproduction because they're not true vintage, but there's the patterns that they themselves sold. So it's just reselling old patterns, I guess. Maybe they adapt them a little bit more for modern times, but yeah, they're all pretty easy to find on their websites. And finally, the one place that I never thought I would find things or that would make it available is actually some museums. Some online websites of museums make patterns in their collections available. One that I am a big fan of is the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is in the UK. And on their website, there are quite a few patterns, sewing and also knitting patterns, that they just make available for free. So one of the ones that I've actually made from that website is the Mary Queen mini dresses from the 1960s, which again is a free pattern. It's just a link away. I made a video about it if you want to hear more. But yeah, I'm pretty sure I found in the past other websites of some museums or other places that are more educational, but they still make them available so you can actually use them. I think from that same museum, one time I made a knitting pattern from the 1940s, from wartime. So yeah, it is a kind of not as expected and free resource that you can even find some stuff there. So once again, once you found the pattern that you were really looking for, and before you get started, make sure to read the pattern sizing, because it is not the same as the modern sizing, and make sure to make a mock-up or toile, meaning make it once with fabric that doesn't really matter, just to make sure that it will fit you, and if you need to make any adjustments, you can make them. And other than that, you should be ready to get started in your journey. I have talked about my own vintage sewing journey in the past, if you want to know more about that and how I got to it and all the struggles on the way. So hopefully this video was very helpful, or a little helpful, and so that you have more of an idea of where you can find what you're looking for. No matter how the journey goes, I hope you enjoy every step of the way of sewing your new vintage patterns, and happy sewing!